Donald Trump's sudden and aggressive shift in rhetoric against Russia is not a random change in policy. It is the direct, unvarnished consequence of a public, personal humiliation that a man of his ego could not possibly ignore. The laughter of a dictator, it turns out, is the last thing you want to hear when you're counting on his support. For months, the Kremlin built its entire strategy on a massive and fatal miscalculation. They believed they had Trump figured out. They saw him as a predictable ally, a man who, driven by his isolationist instincts, would abandon Ukraine and dismantle NATO. The Kremlin's propaganda machine, along with its echo chamber of Z-bloggers and state media, spent months constructing a fantasy narrative around a friend Donnie, a man who would be their savior. They were so confident in this illusion that they made no alternative plans. They made a crucial mistake. They confused Trump's pre-election rhetoric with a firm, predictable commitment. But the reality of their relationship has proven to be a dangerous game of chance. Trump, as we've seen, is not an ally in the traditional sense. He is an ally of his own ego, a man who operates on a transactional basis where personal respect and a sense of dominance are more important than any geopolitical strategy. And in his hubris, the Kremlin made a crucial mistake. They publicly disrespected him. In a series of moves that would have been unthinkable for a traditional diplomat, the Kremlin, through its various mouthpieces, publicly dismissed Trump's offers of negotiation and insisted it would not meet with him. They mocked his attempts at peacemaking and treated his public pronouncements as irrelevant. This was not just a political snub, it was a public slap in the face to a man who believes he is the world's ultimate dealmaker. For a man like Trump, who has spent his entire career cultivating an image of a strong, decisive, and respected leader, this was the ultimate insult. The result was a seismic shift in rhetoric. A man who was once speaking about ending the war in 24 hours is now calling the Russian army a paper tiger and its economy a shithole. This wasn't a new, well-thought-out policy change. It was an impulsive, personal response. He is a man who does not like to be seen as weak, as a man who has been played. His new aggressive rhetoric is a way for him to re-establish his dominance and save face in front of his audience. He is telling the world, and most importantly the Kremlin, that he is not a man to be trifled with. This is a catastrophic development for Russia. The Kremlin had a plan for a predictable, pro-Russian Trump. It had no plan for an unpredictable, anti-Russian Trump. The Kremlin, in its hubris, thought it could control him, but it has now created a new and dangerous enemy who is acting not out of a coherent strategy, but out of a personal vendetta. This is the real reason for the panic in the Kremlin. The war is no longer just a strategic game of chess, it is a deeply personal war of egos, and the Kremlin's arrogance has now turned its most promising potential ally into its most unpredictable and dangerous foe. The strategic blunder the Kremlin made was a classic one. They failed to see that Trump's primary motivation is not geopolitical, it is personal. They assumed that his isolationist rhetoric was a guarantee of a hands-off approach to Russia. Instead, they discovered that his policy is dictated by who last offended him. By publicly rebuffing his attempts at mediation, they guaranteed a reaction designed to hurt them. This personal affront is now driving US policy in a way that is utterly unpredictable and dangerous for Moscow. Trump's reaction is not governed by the cautious deliberations of the Pentagon. It is governed by the need for public vindication. This need to appear strong has forced him to adopt the very policy his deep state critics would have lauded, a forceful anti-Russian stance. He has had to demonstrate that he is tougher on his predecessor, and his words, paper tiger, shithole economy, and the promise of new sanctions are his weapons. The Kremlin's miscalculation is a failure of its own internal information system. They are so insulated by their own propaganda that they failed to understand the fundamental psychology of the man they were dealing with. They assumed that a shared appreciation for autocratic power meant a shared political agenda. They were wrong. And this personal clash of wills is now the single greatest threat to Russia's war effort. The result is a seismic shift in the geopolitical landscape. Trump's aggressive stance is a direct political green light for the West to do what it has been hesitant to do for months. The fear of being seen as soft on Russia is now gone, replaced by a new urgency to be seen as tough. This is a crucial pivot. Trump's ego has, for the first time in his presidency, been aligned with the strategic interests of the Western alliance. His desire to look strong has given the West the political cover it needs to increase the pressure on Russia. This acceleration of pressure, both military and economic, is the direct consequence of the Kremlin's arrogance, a consequence that will cost them far more than they could ever have imagined.
We've discussed the political and psychological clash that drove Donald Trump's sudden, aggressive statements. But the cold, hard reality is that his assessment that the Russian army is a paper tiger was more than just a taunt. It was a devastatingly accurate verdict on a military that is now in terminal decline. This is the end of illusions, a moment when the truth, long suppressed by propaganda, is being screamed from the front lines by the military's own loyalists. The core of Trump's argument is confirmed by every serious analyst, including the military experts who advised him. Russia has failed to achieve a single one of its strategic objectives. As General Kit Kellogg stated, if Russia were winning, it would be in Kyiv, west of the Dnipro, and would have successfully replaced the government. It has done none of those things. Instead, its gains are, at best, measured in meters, not miles, and the cost for those minimal gains is simply unsustainable. This military failure is not a matter of bad luck. It is a systemic problem born of a disastrous strategic doctrine. The Russian command, in a continuous pattern of failure, has tried to win a war of technology and precision with a war of sheer numbers and human sacrifice. The result is a brutal positional stalemate, a grinding attrition that is consuming Russia's most valuable resources. The entire front has seized up, and the army is stuck in a cycle of tactical incompetence and staggering, record-breaking losses that have depleted its reserves of men and equipment. The exhaustion of the Russian army is no longer deniable. The highly trained professional units that launched the invasion in 2022 no longer exist. They have been replaced by a chaotic mix of mobilized personnel and low-quality contract recruits. This continuous degradation of manpower is now a primary factor in the war. The soldiers who are fighting have been on the front line for years without rotation, a profound moral injury that has created a force that is profoundly demoralized and combat ineffective. The voices of the Z-bloggers themselves are the most reliable witnesses to this collapse, openly discussing the lack of motivation, the chronic fatigue, and the high rate of desertion. This human tragedy is compounded by a catastrophic lack of material support. The Russian military is being forced to pull relics from long-term storage, outdated tanks and armored vehicles from the 1950s and 60s to replace its losses. This is the ultimate sign of a military that is scraping the bottom of the barrel, a force that has burned through its most valuable assets. The quantitative advantage that was once the cornerstone of Russian military doctrine is gone, replaced by a desperate reliance on human waves and outdated equipment. The realization that the Russian army is a paper tiger, that its perceived strength is a political facade, is the truth that has now reached the highest levels of Western power. Trump's brutal assessment is simply a recognition of the facts on the ground, facts that have been paid for with an unimaginable price in Russian blood and steel. The war is stuck in a tactical dead end, and the illusion of Russian military might has finally shattered.
We've dissected the military failures, the destroyed units, and the tactical deadlock. But the collapse of the Russian war machine is not a purely military story. It is a financial one. And Donald Trump's brutal assessment, where he called the Russian economy a shithole, was not an insult. It was a devastatingly accurate reflection of a strategic crisis that is now crippling Russia from within. The financial pressure is the single most compelling reason for the escalating panic in the Kremlin. The evidence of this economic breakdown is now undeniable. The Russian state has sacrificed all long-term stability for short-term military gain, creating a profound and dangerous internal crisis. The most immediate sign is the nationwide fuel crisis. This is not a political rumor. It is a reality that is playing out across 24 regions. Ukrainian drone strikes on refineries are the direct cause, having knocked out a significant percentage of Russia's processing capacity. This has led to a cascade of failures, long lines at the pumps, skyrocketing prices, and a massive logistical headache that is directly impacting the military's small-scale operations. The fuel crisis is a self-inflicted wound that highlights the state's inability to protect its own most critical infrastructure. But the domestic crisis is being amplified by a staggering geopolitical paradox that proves Russia is a power in irreversible decline. The Kremlin has been boasting about overcoming international isolation by finding new partners in the East, namely China and India. However, these are not allies. They are opportunistic partners who are ruthlessly exploiting Russia's desperation. They are buying Russian oil and gas at a deep discount, effectively subsidizing the war while simultaneously stripping the Russian state of billions in revenue. This is a profound loss of sovereignty. Russia has not escaped dependency. It has simply traded its reliance on the European market for a humiliating and subservient reliance on China, becoming a junior partner and a primary supplier of discounted raw materials. This is not economic success. It is a financial surrender. The consequences of this financial paradox are the real reason for panic in the high command. The Russian leadership is trapped. They are attempting to run a full-scale 21st century war on a 20th century budget, and they are failing. The money being funneled into the military machine is starving the civilian sector, creating a vicious cycle of decline that threatens to undermine the regime's stability. The economic failures are now directly translating into military incapacity. The budget drain. The enormous, growing budget deficit, which the government is struggling to fund even by raising taxes and risking inflation, is all being poured into a military black hole. The inevitable collapse. The combination of a crippled civilian economy and a loss of sovereignty to China means the war is financially unsustainable. The leadership is facing a choice between ending the war now and facing immediate political instability, or continuing the war and guaranteeing a complete economic collapse later. This is the ultimate reason why the panic is justified. The state is losing its ability to fund its war and provide for its people. The economic crisis is not just a problem for the Ministry of Finance, it is a direct, existential threat to the regime's stability. The war is being lost not on the battlefield alone, but in the bank accounts of the Russian state, a financial collapse that will ultimately determine the outcome of the war.
We've established the psychological game that drove Donald Trump's sudden, aggressive statements. But the most significant part of this story is not the rhetoric, it's the consequences. Trump's shift in tone is more than just a personal act of defiance. It is a green light for the West to do what it has been afraid to do for months. This moment marks a profound strategic turning point, a new road to victory that Russia, in its arrogance, has now paved for its enemies. For years, the Western alliance, and particularly Europe, was paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. European countries were hesitant to increase their aid to Ukraine, worried that their actions would be seen as provocative and would anger the former US president. That fear that the United States would punish its allies for being too supportive was a powerful tool for Russia, a source of paralysis that allowed it to continue its brutal war. But that paralysis is now gone. Trump's new aggressive rhetoric has created a new political reality. The man who once called European allies freeloaders is now calling Russia a paper tiger and its leader a failure. The fear of being seen as soft on Russia is now replaced by a new urgency to be seen as tough. This is a crucial pivot. Trump's ego has, for the first time in his presidency, been perfectly aligned with the strategic interests of the Western alliance. His desire to look strong and decisive has given the West the political cover it needs to accelerate the pressure on Russia. This alignment is not a coincidence. It is the strategic consequence of Putin's miscalculation. The acceleration of pressure is now manifesting through two critical channels: economic strangulation and military modernization. On the economic front, Trump's stance is a green light for a new, aggressive sanctions regime. He can now use his political influence to push for measures that truly target Russia's lifeblood. The most critical opportunity lies in targeting Russia's shadow fleet. This is an armada of aging, poorly maintained tankers that Russia uses to circumvent Western sanctions and sell its oil globally. This fleet is the financial artery of the Russian war economy. A targeted, coordinated sanction against this fleet would have a massive, immediate impact on Russia's oil revenue, which is the singular source of funding for the war. Trump's threats are not about simply adding a few names to a sanctions list. They are about dismantling the very infrastructure Russia uses to survive. The political cover to execute this devastating action has now been granted. On the military front, the gloves are off. Trump's rhetoric has eliminated the previous political restrictions that hampered Ukraine's ability to fight effectively. Military and diplomatic sources confirm that the US is now considering lifting all restrictions on strikes deep into Russian territory, a stance explicitly backed by US officials, who have stated that unrestricted zones no longer exist. Furthermore, the potential transfer of weapons like the Tomahawk cruise missile is now openly being discussed. This isn't just about selling older arms, it is about accelerating the strategic capability of Ukraine. This is also directly linked to the massive proposed $90 billion arms deal and the agreement on drone manufacturing with Ukraine. Trump's ego has paved the way for Ukraine to become a powerhouse of drone production and a recipient of advanced long-range American weaponry. This is the ultimate paradox of the Trump era. The instability that was once a threat to the West has now become a direct existential threat to Russia. The man who was supposed to be a tool for the Kremlin has instead become its most powerful and unpredictable enemy. Trump's shift in rhetoric is not a simple change in policy. It is a strategic turning point that will fundamentally alter the course of the war. It is a moment where the world's most powerful military alliance has been given the green light to do what it needs to do to win. And it is a signal to Russia that its time is running out.
We have meticulously chronicled the psychological blunder, the military paralysis, and the economic catastrophe that has gripped Russia. Now we arrive at the final, comprehensive verdict. The core of this crisis is not simply a battle for territory, it is a battle against internal contradictions. The Russian leadership has gambled everything, and the path to victory for Ukraine is now clear. The war will end not on Moscow's terms, but on Kyiv. The evidence points to a massive systemic failure that has rendered the war machine strategically bankrupt. The Russian military is consumed by the mobilization crisis, the ultimate internal contradiction. Military analysts and Z-channels agree. Achieving any semblance of victory requires a massive new draft, a force estimated at 700,000 to 900,000 men to sustain the front lines. This is the necessary military solution, but it is also a political impossibility. The regime is paralyzed by the fear of social backlash, knowing that such a move would shatter the illusion of stability and invite a political crisis that could endanger the entire structure of power. This fear is the final piece of the puzzle. The leadership is caught in a fatal contradiction. It must choose between military effectiveness and political survival. By sacrificing military effectiveness, by refusing to mobilize and allowing its professional core to atrophy, the Kremlin is simply guaranteeing a slow, grinding defeat. The continuation of the war is thus contingent on an internal lie. They are delaying the inevitable, but every day they delay, the cost of that inevitable defeat grows exponentially. The collapse of the Russian war effort is now a multi-layered reality. It is military, marked by the destruction of elite units and the reliance on outdated equipment. It is financial, defined by a growing budget deficit and the systematic strangulation of oil revenues. And it is moral, symbolized by the illegal retention of soldiers who are being held against their will, serving in a state of perpetual service that is actively breeding dissent within the armed forces. The Russian army is being dismantled by its own internal decay. This internal failure is now being met with an aggressive, unified response from the West. Trump's sudden and aggressive rhetoric, the promise of new sanctions, and the potential for new, powerful weapons transfers are all adding pressure to an already collapsing structure. The political gamble has backfired. The unpredictable behavior of a key Western leader is now serving a strategic purpose that Putin never intended, accelerating the financial and military collapse of the Russian state. The final verdict is that the Russian war is lost. It will not end with a military conquest, but with a systemic failure that makes continuation impossible. The panic in the Kremlin is justified, and the war will end on Ukraine's terms, delivered by the relentless pressure of internal contradictions and external resolve. The war has entered its ultimate decisive phase, and the conclusion is clear. The path to victory for Ukraine is now an unstoppable trajectory fueled by Russia's strategic and political failures. The summer of 2025 was the moment the old war died, and the new war, a war of attrition against Russia's own economic core, began. The ultimate sign of this new reality is the Kremlin's desperate internal debate over mobilization. The core of the matter is simple. The Russian military is in a state of existential exhaustion. The military's own professional voices are demanding a massive draft, a solution that the regime is too cowardly to execute. The system is so morally bankrupt that it is actively sacrificing its best, most experienced soldiers, holding them illegally beyond their contracts just to avoid the political risk of a new mobilization. This moral decay guarantees that any new draft would be ineffective, flooding the army with untrained, ill-equipped men who would only accelerate the casualty rate. The war will end because the financial and military systems are collapsing simultaneously. The economic decay is starving the military, while the external pressure, amplified by the political shift in the West, is denying Russia any easy out. The only option for the Kremlin is to choose between two catastrophic outcomes: a political collapse by mobilizing, or an economic collapse by continuing to bleed resources. The final verdict is sealed. The war will conclude with a negotiation dictated by Kiev because Russia's capacity to continue the fight is finite. The Russian leadership's inability to adapt, its failure to protect its most critical infrastructure, and its self-destructive commitment to a war it cannot afford are the final damning pieces of evidence. The war is lost, and the only question that remains is how much more they are willing to lose before they admit it.